welcome to another episode of Exploring Standards. I am Jess, your host, and today I'm very excited to have Bex Deadman back on the podcast. Hi Bex, how are you?
Hello Jess, I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me back for a second one. How exciting.
Very exciting. So if you haven't listened before, Bex has already been on the podcast talking about travel risk management in ISO 31030. So make sure you give that episode a listen. Bex is our travel risk management expert. She is the woman. She's known as Travel Risk Bex. And so today we are going to be talking all about what is TRM. Bex also has her own podcast, Talking TRM. So if you're looking for more information about travel risk management, her podcast is absolutely fantastic. Please go and give that a listen. Let's get straight into the first question, which is, what is TRM?
Okay, well, another lovely acronym which we like to use, obviously in business, but it is travel risk management, just to spell it out. We talk about it in lots of different terms, and I think people have lots of different perceptions of what it is. So it's probably worth just kind of spelling it out literally, I guess, from a standards perspective, but what we're talking about. So when people think about risk in travel, they tend to think about high risk countries and that kind of thing because they probably have some processes and some thoughts around that and some things in place. What we're actually talking about, though, when we talk about travel risk management, is the understanding of risk management, which is basically applying a process and a framework to your business that looks forward and backwards and assesses the potential hazards and risks that could affect your business, and that can be across everything from cyber to financial. Your due diligence stuff when you're looking at perhaps buying another company. This all comes into the risk management umbrella and sits comfortably under the standard 31,000. But when we talk about travel risk management, we're talking about applying that understanding, but using travel as the sector that we're actually exploring. And when we start doing that, that's when it gets really interesting and much bigger than those high risk countries, because we're looking at trying to create a framework that ultimately protects our travellers and also our assets and other things that associated with it. But most importantly, it's about our travellers. So it's often kind of considered as people risk management as well, but using travel as the thing that they are doing at that point. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned protecting the assets, but as you said, it is people risk management. And actually, one of the biggest assets in a company is the people. So that makes sense.
Well, we talk about it being a lot, but whether we actually then put the stuff in place to make sure that those people are protected is another thing. But that's exactly what this is about. It's an enabler to do that for sure.
Yeah, fantastic. So, why is travel risk management important?
I think it's always been important. And to be fair, companies have been looking at this for a long, long time. And I go back to those kind of high risk destinations, or those companies having to operate in a kind of hostile situations, or those first companies that go in after a traumatic weather or event or anything like that. So there are companies that are really into this space. But what's happened, I think, in the last 20 to 30 years, and I think if we really think about kind of pre-COVID and post-COVID, which is how people in travel tend to think these days, the world has just changed. It's just not acceptable now to kind of expect your travelers to go off and do stuff that maybe was acceptable to do 30 years ago without kind of giving them some support around it. It's not to say they shouldn't do it, but there's a lot more emphasis now on understanding what the person is doing, why they're going, and actually who that person is. Are they the right person to go, and all of that sort of stuff? Because and it's not, like I say, just about high risk events either. It's about anything that kind of happened to a person when they're traveling. So it's just we're kind of we're in a world now, and I talk about this a lot, but I sort of describe it as risks are happening. This isn't just a kind of, oh, this might happen. We literally turn on our computers every day, or we look at our phones, and there's another thing that's happened. So it's not just a case of if it will, it's when it will, and where will it be. That's the sort of that's the world as it is today. And be that crime, be that weather, be that terrorism, be that war, which is kind of what we're dealing with now. And two different countries in the world are at war ultimately, and this is so you've got that level of it. Then there's another side of it, which is the travel industry itself is recovering from COVID. They are struggling still with, they're selling, but when it actually comes to operating, there's all sorts of complications and issues around that, from staffing, from actually having their slots. And that's not just airlines, it's rail, it's affecting accommodation. Um, so there's major issues with just how that operates. So that's not just a kind of, it's not just a, oh, when stuff goes wrong. It's like, it probably will go wrong. You will probably get delayed. You will probably have cancellations. So how do we help you and support you with that? And then you've got this third part, which I think ultimately for me is the most important part. And I think why I do it is my drive. The people are so, the people now working in our companies are incredible. They're so diverse, but we all have a completely different set of requirements and needs. And a lot of the policies and the processes are based on what would have been acceptable for male executives wherever they are in the world. It's not. But they're not necessarily considering females. They're not necessarily considering LGBTQI. They're not necessarily considering mental health or neurodiversity. And it's just kind of not fit for purpose anymore. So what we're sort of basically saying is, we're going to give you the absolute minimum to do this job. We're going to cut back on costs. We're not really going to give you any support, but we expect you to do that. And actually, if you don't do that, there's a chance you might lose your job. Like, it's a pretty rubbish place to be.
Mhm.
And actually, travel risk management takes all of that away if we get to look at it in a different way, because we look at it from a risk perspective across the whole 360. At the moment, travel is fundamentally managed by cost. And that's why we're in the state that we're in, because people aren't thinking about people. They are, and I say this a lot, so anyone who listens on my podcast will be like, oh, she's banging on about that again. But the way that companies manage travel currently is on a spreadsheet in their finance department, and it's a pain in the backside. So what they don't see is every single line on that spreadsheet is a lived experience of one of their employees or teams or guests or whatever. And the better that experience is, the better for everyone. So that's why this is important. And I think for the first time, the standard 31030, as much as everyone has been doing stuff in this space, the standard kind of puts a line in the sand and says, look, you kind of need to be doing this now. Because if something does go wrong, you don't have to do it. But if something does go wrong and this standard exists and you haven't even looked at it, it's not gonna be ideal. So
Okay.
standards move stuff across, which is what's happening now.
Which is fantastic, and it is slowly, a bit slowly, but it is moving in the right direction, which is really good, and that's what we want.
Well, I say slowly, Jess, but then I spoke to someone yesterday and they were like, oh my God, it feels like you've been doing this for years. And I was like, I know, I've literally been doing it for, 18 months. But there's been so much packed in. So it is moving. It's moving more quickly than I think it is. And it's definitely going to continue to evolve.
Yeah, definitely. So, can you tell us about how you manage risk in travel?
I can give you some tips. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
So one of the biggest challenges is kind of actually understanding what it is that you do as a company and why it is that you travel. And there's various reasons for that. And that can be from if you're a smaller company right up to you're a larger company. But obviously, the bigger you are, the more complicated it is, and potentially the more partners you'll have involved in the solution. So the issue is data. Firstly, a lot of companies don't really have full visibility of what it is that they're actually doing. And in order to approach and understand your risks associated to what it is that you're trying to manage, you kind of need to understand what it is that you're doing. So at the moment, companies kind of have this almost blanket approach with how they approach their insurance. They have this sort of, well, we'll just kind of cover everything for everything. And insurance companies have, developed their products around that. But actually, it would be a lot more helpful if they could be a bit more personalized and customized to what the customers want. So,
Mhm.
and the other problem with it is because for the last sort of 25 years, travel management companies have been selling duty of care as a solution with technology. And I'm not saying they're not doing a good job, but they're not doing the whole job. However, that's not what the client hears when they hear a duty of care solution. So you've kind of got this weird place where it's partly insurance, partly TMC, there's assistance companies involved, but no one really understands fully what it is that the program is. And then when you're trying to bring in new providers, you just kind of move the problem along rather than understanding it. So before you do anything, you have to get your head together and know what it is.
Mhm.
And this is this is my favorite bit. Whenever I go into a client, this is literally my favorite bit, because I go in and they're like, "Oh God, we've got this problem and that problem and la 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 la," and I'm generally dealing with procurement or security. Um, and I say, "Okay, well, look, here's our list of stakeholders," and they're like, "No one manages travel, no one looks after it," and I'm like, "I know, but there are people with a vested interest, so let's have
Mhm.
a chat to them and let's start pulling some stuff together because you only have this viewpoint at the moment." And then we do it and we bring in, especially in the larger companies where they've got the resources. So you're bringing in cybersecurity, you're bringing data, you bring in legal, you bring in HR, you bring in QHSE, you bring in travel itself, you bring in any security teams, you've got any risk teams, and it's just this kind of, and procurement, obviously, if you're not dealing with procurement and finance, because they're potentially, and you just bring the whole thing and suddenly, and you just ask them, what's going on? How does it affect you? What do you know? Because often there'll be travelers as well, although I'll certainly have teams that travel. So you kind of get a unique perspective. Um, and then you start to actually understand what it is your program is. And
Mhm.
from there, you can then start thinking about the risks. But you can't think about the risks until you know what it is. There's no point thinking, oh, we'll put all this stuff in place for our international travel if you
Uh-huh.
don't travel internationally. It's just a waste of resources. And obviously, the risks are different if you're based in the UK versus going out to high risk countries. You've got to think about it in a different way. So, the first part is to understand what it is that you're dealing with. And then from there, you start thinking about the risks associated to it. So you do it at a high level, from a strategic level. What are the risks associated to the program by not doing anything, by not moving, by not bringing in providers, by not having stuff in place? And then you get right down to that kind of operational level. So you start thinking about people, assets, and what could happen. So I have this, risk assessment template that I go through with my clients. And, to be fair, most of the risks that happen will be the same for company over. But,
Yeah.
things like, what happens if somebody gets ill on a trip? What happens, God forbid, if somebody dies on a trip? What are the circumstances of that? And you sort of build out the sort of different scenarios, and then you can work out what your solutions are. But that's how we do it. We have to be really honest with ourselves, and we have to know what it is that we're dealing with. Who are our people? Who are traveling? What communities are they coming from across the business? And how are we going to support them? Because ultimately, it's the traveler that's on their own when they're out there, and that's what you're trying to sort of build something around. Does that answer it? I feel like I've gone on quite a lot there.
No, that does answer. I love it. I like the idea of going into the company first and then picking bits from the company, being, well, let's look at what you're doing, because there's no point, looking at the whole big picture until you've looked at your small picture. So I think that is very helpful.
Good.
Um, you've briefly just touched on this. You have a template, but how do you do a travel risk assessment?
Yeah, no, so the templates for the risk register, so that's another template. But a travel risk assessment is something that really, as far as any standards in this space are concerned, is the place that you start. So when
Mhm.
we think about pre-travel approvals and things like that in travel, it's usually around cost, and are
Okay.
usually built into the booking tool. So at the time of making the booking, if you go over something, then it's flagged and it's sent off for approval. But that all has to happen in quite a lot of time constraints, um, because the booking won't hold and there's issues with losing the spaces and that kind of stuff. What we're talking about when we talk about a pre-travel risk assessment is actually looking at the reasons for the trip, the purpose of the trip, what you're trying to achieve from the trip, what's the potential ROI on the trip, what are the risks associated to the destination, but what are the risks also associated to the activity, and what are the risks associated to the actual person doing it? So from anything from where they are as far as their health is concerned, to their personal preferences, or lifestyle choices, or religion. Um, all of those things make up a risk pattern, and they're all completely individual and unique to that specific trip, destination, person, and activity.
Yeah.
And what a risk assessment does is kind of cover all of this off. So the key factor is that you need to be able to, once you've done a risk assessment, you need to make sure as an organization you're providing that traveller with the information that they need, that you've done your absolute best. You haven't just done a risk assessment and then gone, off you go then, go and find out all of this. Which, to be fair, is what some companies do, and there's nothing wrong with that, because you do want your travellers to do a bit. They are responsible for stuff. They need to know things, and you want them to see that they've gone off and said, okay, if I'm going to Nigeria, I know that I need to do this, this, and this. You know, there's a checklist to a degree. But you also want to make sure you're providing them with that stuff that they need. Don't just go off and find yourself an agent out there. We've got one, and we've we vetted them and that kind of stuff. And all this should happen at the point that a trip is even considered, not at the point of booking. This should happen, at the moment it happens maybe for companies, maybe it's a conversation between a manager, maybe it's something that, there's a level of risk assessment that happens depending again on the destination. But really this should happen for every trip, in order for a company to fulfill their full duty of care details. Now, it's not always practical to do that, and companies literally go, whoa, when I say that. But actually, there's ways around it. If people are doing the same trip again and again and again, you don't have to go through a full risk assessment every time. You can tack it to that and just add, are certain key questions that do require you to do it. So it's not quite as arduous as it sounds. But actually, from a perspective, if you find yourself in court because something happened to one of your travellers, the first question they're going to ask you is, did you do a pre-travel risk assessment? And if you didn't,
why?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, you don't really have a leg to stand on. It's the biggest piece, the biggest pain point in 31/30 when we're trying to talk about it to travellers. They don't like it. They don't understand it. Travellers don't want to complete it. But you kind of think, well, it just needs to be talked about in a different way, which is what I try and do.
Yeah, and I think you're right. If you bring in someone like yourself, a consultant, if you get a good structure in place, as you said, then it just makes it easier going forward. If it's a mess to begin with, then it is going to be really difficult and really tricky. But if you get it set up well and you can then start to reuse it, makes
This is
sense.
it, and I'm working with a client who has just agreed to get one, and I'm so pleased because they understand that some of their issues are the visibility of when the people are traveling. So, and that's because they're a huge company and they're across different countries, and there's companies within their company operating differently because, like a lot of companies, that's how they're set up, and it's difficult to communicate to everybody and all of that kind of stuff. Some where we got visibility of travel, some we haven't. I mean, this is standard across all companies. Like it just is whatever companies say. Um, by putting this in at the front and automating this process and not making it just about high risk, making it about everything, you have a point of reference. So if something does happen, you're not scrambling around going, oh God, the global tool I had actually doesn't have all the data. I now need to try and find who that agent is and whatever. Potentially that these people were going to go on a trip and they were approved. So it gives you a starting point at least to give you an idea. So it just helps. I obviously think it's a positive thing, but it is it helps frame what we're trying to do and to put risk as the most important piece in this.
So my final question is, and I know you kind of already touched about this, but we'll go into a little bit more detail, which is what standards are there for TRM?
Okay, so at the moment, there's ISO 31030, which obviously we talk about a lot, which is a guidance standard. It's an ISO, so an international standard. It came out in September 2021. It's been really, really well received. There's been organisations at this point, you can align to it. You can't, it's not a certification standard. So you align to the principles of it. And ultimately, it's taking risk management 31,000 and putting travel in, as we said right at the beginning, as this as the kind of thing that you're looking at and you're mitigating against specifically, because it's such a big topic. So that's it as it stands right now. But when that standard was being created, it was seen that it was aimed at organisations. So it's aimed at any type of organisation, however big you are, whether you're a charity, whether you're a corporate, whatever. And initially it was considered maybe it can include schools and things like that. But actually, there's obviously another whole other area of safeguarding when you're thinking about travelling with children or taking children away. So there's a second standard coming, which is 31031. So if you have 31030 guidance for organisations, you have 31031 guidance for youth travel, which is massive. Like, I can't even believe there wasn't a standard. I mean, don't get me wrong, there have been safeguarding standards and different things, but nothing sort of quite specifically aimed in the way that this is. But it's great that there is now. And then I'm working on another set of standards with ISO and BSI to look at travel service providers. And this could potentially be the first certification standard that comes out within this space. Reason being is that both those, the youth travel and the organisations, rely on the travel service providers, and actually they can give auditable proof that they're doing this stuff, and actually they probably should. It shouldn't just be, oh yeah, we're just aligning to it. This can be the difference between life and death in a situation, and it's about defining responsibilities between the service providers and the client. So it's really, really important. So we're doing a lot of work there. And then there's the potential just to grow. This sector is huge. It's due to sort of triple in value as a sector in the next sort of 5 years. And using these standards as a sort of framework to kind of build everything that comes from here is just really good. So yeah, there's a few. We might do some more, but they're being really well received. That, I get calls weekly about this standard. I talk about it all the time. So it's definitely one of the most popular out there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. We shall keep an eye out. We'll obviously post any news that we hear on the standards that are coming. So it's a very exciting time in travel risk management.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Bex, for joining us on the show today. I hope you've enjoyed it.
I have. I've just thought maybe I talked too much, but you knew I can't even speak. You knew what you were getting, and I love it. So no, I'm really grateful that I've come back and done it again, and I'm really pleased that so many people are interested in this. So we don't do a second one if people aren't interested. So it's good that you're getting some feedback. It's cool.
Absolutely. So just for our listeners, once again, I've been talking to Travel Risk Bex, which is Bex Deadman. If you'd like to check out her podcast, her very own podcast, it's Talking TRM, and you can find that on all major platforms. So thank you for listening to today's episode. If you have enjoyed it, please make sure you rate, review, and subscribe. That really, really helps the podcast. I will be back with another episode in a couple of weeks.